of the strange settings on WebEx that we're using, it did not have the correct settings, and so I couldn't hear anybody, so I apologize for that. Okay, so hi everyone. We are continuing today in Rabbi Sage's Emunot Videot. This is Daniel Karapkin from Thornhill, Ontario, speaking on behalf of webyeshiva.org. And we are continuing in this endeavor of trying to understand Rabbi Sage's worldview, and we are going to finish the third chapter of the first treatise of Emunot Videot, the Book of Faith and Opinions. If you've been following along, Rabbi Sage is not satisfied with presenting the philosophical arguments for the Torah's narrative of creation. He also feels he has to present to us a total of 12 alternate models of creation or of cosmogony that were circulating during his lifetime, and to demonstrate why they make no sense. And in the course of discussing these ideas about creation, the origins of the universe, we're also seeing different worldviews, not just limited to ideas about the origins of existence, but also different ways that people think and their attitudes towards philosophical thought and logic and speculation. And these last two out of the additional 12 that Reb Sage is going to present to us, what we're going to call number 12 and number 13, are really great examples of that these are philosophical worldviews that are not limited to an understanding of where we come from and what the origins of our existence are, but really speak to a much larger question, which is how reliable is the mind as an arbiter of truth? Okay, and so it's sort of a continuation of what we had started last week, but these are the last two opinions that we're going to see for today. And so we're going to just share the screen. Our handout is available, as we say every week, on the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevuchim, and it's also available on webyeshiva.org's course description. So just to catch up where we were, after presenting the Torah's model of creation in time from absolute nothing, Rabbi Sage set out to present 12 additional models of creation based on philosophical models that were in vogue in his time. He set out to refute each of them systematically. In today's share, we discuss the final two erroneous models, both based on the arguments that human knowledge is too limited to explore cosmogony and to arrive at truth on these lofty matters. So this is model 12 and model 13. So model number 12, literally, if you read the Hebrew and the Arabic, it means those who refrain, those who abstain from exploring these topics. And Rosenblatt, I believe correctly so, and if you want to follow along in the Rosenblatt edition of the translation, it's on page 80 in the English translation. He says, he calls it skepticism, and we'll talk a little bit about the skeptics in just a moment. But let's see first what Rabbi Sage says. This model argues that man should refrain from trusting his intellect and should not believe anything presented by the intellect. Speculation is unreliable, leading to many doubts. And the way that Rabbi Sage is presenting this 12th model is that it's okay to follow what your senses tell you, but it's not okay to carry on from your senses and to conclude anything that your intellect would suggest. And just doing some research on the web, ancient skepticism, particularly the Pyrrhonian and academic forms, posits that the human mind cannot definitively determine truth. Skeptics argue that we should suspend judgment, what is called epoche, because our senses and reason are unreliable and can lead to contradictory conclusions. They do not necessarily deny the existence of truth, but rather the human capacity to grasp it with certainty. So there is a truth, it's just that the human mind is not capable of understanding the truth because our human minds are too limited. Now, there are many who still believe in that today, that we are really living in a world of illusion and nothing that is being conveyed by our senses is in any way really accurate. So this is the view of the ancient skeptics. And it's really one of the benefits that we get by studying a 10th century text like this is to remind ourselves, and Rabbi Sadia is culling from people to him were ancient, meaning that they were from the Greeks, going back to even before the Common Era. These beliefs have been circulating throughout the world ever since man has had the chance to cogitate and reflect on these ideas. So what does the argument go of these skeptics? We see that man's mind perceives things like people see things by the light of a flash of lightning, meaning that human perception is extremely fleeting and unreliable, just like we see only fleeting images and cannot be sure of anything we imagine. If everything is pitch dark and all of a sudden just a flash of lightning comes, you only see things for an instant and you can't really believe if what you saw is really there. Like one of those horror movies where, you're in a dark room and all of a sudden the lightning strikes and you see some horrible figure. And then all of a sudden they turn on the lights and that figure is gone. It's that kind of idea where you don't really know if you're really perceiving things at all. We did see in the Rambam also in one of his quotes from Moreh Nevuchim that people sometimes only get flashes of inspiration, just quick glimpses, and then it goes away. But he says these people are even more foolish than the sophists, which was what we learned last week, those who believe that all reality is both eternal and created. This is because the reality of things depends solely on human thinking, if you remember what the sophists had said. And so if human beings are capable of conceiving things, then anything that a human being conceives is true for that conceiver. So therefore, if one person conceives of the world being eternal and the other one conceives of it having been created in time, then the sophists believe that both are true. The skeptics believe that neither is true, because the sophists admit lies together with truth, but that's not as bad as denying both truths and lies as the skeptics do. I will demonstrate their fallacy in the hope that I can convince them toward the truth. That is, provided that they are open to debate and aren't already so far submerged in ignorance like the final group that I will mention later, whom Rebbe Sadia simply calls the category of the foolish. So let's just quickly present 7 arguments against this worldview of the skeptics. First of all, if they truly believe in suspending all judgment, then they should suspend judgment about their own belief to suspend judgment. They must abstain from abstention. In other words, if you're skeptical that your mind is capable of formulating any truth, then you should be skeptical about that very ideology. How do you know that skepticism is a real thing? You should be skeptical about skepticism. And so it's sort of like a never-ending cycle that folds into itself and self-destructs. He says, I'm only arguing what I've applied to myself, in that my whole basis for believing in things proved by the intellect is based on logic, and logic is a tool of the intellect. So I'm at least consistent. I know that I'm working within a system that is based on certain premises of logic. I use logic, and I have to apply logic to even buy into a system of logic. I have to have a premise that the intellect is logical in order to be able to work through whatever I'm working through philosophically. But the skeptics should work with the same premise. If they're negating the possibility of knowing anything, then they should negate the ideology that man cannot know anything. Number 2, their very logical arguments against their opponents to prove their theory of abstention or skepticism is based on scientific methodology that they should be denying. It's very similar to the first argument. You're using philosophical proofs to prove that man cannot know anything, but those philosophical proofs are only reliable if man's intellect counts for something. If you're concluding that man's intellect counts for nothing, well, how did you get there? You only got there through using the philosophical method, which relies on intellectual arguments. So again, it's a circular thing. Number 3, they use their intellects to flee from harm, just as they resort to their vision and hearing when they need to accomplish their goals. This proves that they don't really subscribe to skepticism, because if a person really felt that he couldn't trust anything that he concludes in his mind, he would have to sort of remain motionless, because really, if I think that the next step I'm going to take is on the ground, maybe I can't trust my senses or my intellect, and maybe I'm about to step into nothingness, and so I shouldn't do anything. But the fact is that people, even though they're skeptical about human perception, comport themselves in their lives as if they can rely on their logic and on their imagination in order to accomplish things in life. So that in itself is an inherent contradiction based on their behavior. Number four, the fact that they employ expert craftsmen, physicians, engineers, and so forth proves that they don't believe in their theory, because according to them, no one's intellect is reliable, so no one person is better than the other to accomplish a task. If you need brain surgery, why don't you get someone who's not a brain surgeon? If the brain surgeon has no more reliable knowledge than a guy who never graduated high school, why don't you get that guy to do brain surgery on you instead of the brain surgeon? Obviously, not something that we would tell you to try at home, okay? Right? Number five, if they truly believe that the intellect is unreliable, how can they claim to remember things accurately and bear testimony in court? This refutes their doctrine, since they are relying on their intellects and not on their senses alone, their immediate senses. They clearly acknowledge that the human mind is a reliable tool to be able to appreciate things and to be able to testify about them. Number six, we saw this also last week. Number six, the fact that they apply their minds to coming up with solutions and good things in their future demonstrates that they don't really believe in the unreliability of the intellect, because they shouldn't ever plan for taking a vacation or for retiring or for doing anything in their future that might bode well for them, because how do they know? How can they rely on their intellects to promise them or to ensure them anything? And these are all variations on the same theme. And finally, number seven, they praise those who do good and deride those who do evil. They support those who speak truth and condemn those who lie. This too refutes their belief in abstention from intellectual pursuit and corroborates the true belief in the intellect. So all of these put together demonstrates that the skeptics are hypocrites as well as being skeptics, because they claim that you cannot trust the mind, but they do trust their mind in order to be able to function on a day-to-day basis. Based on these seven arguments, conjoined with the arguments we made in the introduction, and remember, we want to remind you that we spent a significant amount of time on the introduction, Rebbe Sajja's introduction to Emunot Videot, where he gave us a long exposition on epistemology and logic, that you are able to conclude certain things based on a philosophical method of logical induction and deduction, and about how the mind is a capable arbiter of at least ascertaining some level of truth and reality. So based on everything that I've argued there, plus these seven sort of variations on the same idea, this proves that these skeptics are really do rely on the intellect, and therefore we can prove to them the Torah's narrative of creation. This is all also borne by scripture, as it says in Proverbs, Havinu pitayim orma uchesilim havinu lev, meaning the foolish people take heart and realize that you are capable of understanding. In other words, the very argument that I'm making to my fellow, to the skeptics of my time, is something that King Solomon said to the skeptics of his time, which is, wake up, foolish people. You are capable of understanding and really taking things to heart. Don't be so dismissive of what the human mind is bringing to you as far as ideas. Appreciate that there is substance to those ideas. So that's model number 12. Now we get to model number 13, the final model, who Rebbe Sajja simply calls the fools. Now, not only do they deny anything suggested by the intellect, they even believe that our sensory perception is false. Their point is that nothing is true, even that which is perceived by the senses. They go one step beyond the skeptics and say that everything is false. Nothing is here. Nothing is real. There's nothing out there. Whereas the skeptics believe that there is truth, but that we simply don't have reliable tools to convince ourselves that we know the truth. The fools, what he calls the fools, don't even believe that there is any truth out there. Nothing really exists. Now, I just want to make just a note of this. I tried to research this a little bit, because at least we had Rosenblatt point out to us that the previous opinion is that of the skeptics. But who are these fools? Is who in ancient Greek philosophy subscribes to this idea? So who are this group? It's hard to quantify, but there may be a school of ancient nihilism that is mentioned by secondary authors among the Greek philosophers. For example, the ancient philosopher Gorgias was quoted by Sextus, also an ancient philosopher, as making three statements. Gorgias allegedly said, nothing exists. If anything exists, it cannot be known. And if anything can be known, it cannot be communicated. So basically, he's not only just a skeptic, he's a pessimist, he's a nihilist, in that he doesn't believe that anything is real. Nothing exists. That's his first statement. And Reb Sadia says that these people that are alive during his time as well, these are the most foolish group of all. If we were to ask them, is it possible for something to be eternal? Or is it possible for something to be created? Or is it possible that something can both be created and eternal? Or is it possible that something could be neither eternal nor created? They would say to all of these propositions, yes, absolutely. Anything is possible and nothing is possible, because nothing exists, or even if it does exist, we don't even know anything about it. Okay, similarly, if we ask them, is it possible for a creature to be a human being and not a donkey, or a donkey and not a human being? Or can a creature be both at the same time or neither at the same time? They would also reply, yes, everything is possible because nothing is real. There is no reasoning with such people, since no matter what kind of logical argument we can try to produce to demonstrate their folly, they will deny with crookedness and exaggeration. They're basically just going to brush everything off because nothing is real. Even the words coming out of your mouth aren't real, and so therefore, why do I even have to listen? About such people, scripture is quite derisive. So he quotes from two verses in Proverbs from Sefer Mishlei, one from chapter 18. So the words are, L'ta'ava yivakesh nifrad. And the way Rashi understands the first part of the verse is, Mishu nifrad me hakadosh baruch hu shelo lishmor mitzvotav l'tavat libo v'yitzro hara hurodef v'sof. And he basically hurodef, that a person who, because of his lusts and physical desires, separates from God and wishes to convince himself that nothing is real, that's what that person is going to do. And b'chol tushia yitgala, what do those last words mean? V'sof b'chol tushia yitgala ben chachamim tigale cherpato. That eventually among the wise, that's tushia, the people who support the Torah, yitgala, he will be revealed. In other words, we will expose you as being a fraud, because the whole basis of your philosophy is based on your desire to indulge in just whatever you want with complete abandon and without any sense of conscience. That's the reason why you subscribe to such a folly, to such a foolish theology or ideology. And then he quotes a second verse in Proverbs 23, verse 9, Bo'oznek seal al tedaber ki yavuz l'seichel milecha. Don't even bother trying to speak with the fool, because he will immediately reject and deride the logic of your words. And so that's why Rabbi Sadia says, right after he quotes these verses in Mishlei, there is really no point in entering into logical disputation with them by asking them, is your claim that there is not truth based on logic or folly? That's a waste of time, since they don't investigate things logically. I mean, I'm almost tempted to say that this is like trying to go up to one of those protesters who supports Hamas and trying to logically argue with them. Like, there's no point in it, because there are some people who just are so convinced that they are right because they haven't invested their intellectual energy into an endeavor and are just completely drawn in by their desires, that there's nothing you can say to sway them. The only way to trip them up is by waiting for them to get hungry and then observe them crying out for food, or wait until they get thirsty and see them cry out for drink, or to strike them with sticks until they cry out in pain. In other words, if you truly believe that nothing exists, then your hunger is not hunger, your thirst is not thirst, and because you're not really there. And so if you're not really there, then why should you be cry out in pain and ask for food when food is not real and you're not real, and so forth? Why should you cry out for drink when there's nothing here? Their acknowledgement of their feelings of hunger, thirst, and pain is itself a refutation of their theory that you cannot trust your senses. And when they accept our food and drink to alleviate their needs, or they accept respite from the blows, then they will acknowledge not only sensory perception, but also the things that result from those perceptions. In other words, they're forced to acknowledge, of course, you sense things and your feelings are feelings, and the thoughts that result from those feelings are real. We will therefore push them step by step until they will be forced to acknowledge the veracity of human intellect. This will lead them to acknowledge the truths of creation. And if they fail to submit, it is only because they have already fallen into complete despair and are beyond repair. There's nothing we can do to help them. And so about such people, scripture says, once again from Mishlei, Al tichtosh et ha'evil b'machtesh b'toch harifot ba'oli lo tasur me'alav yivalto. And essentially what King Solomon is saying is that even if you were to take the fool and to put him in a mortar and pestle in the same place where you grind up freshly harvested wheat in order to separate the chaff from the wheat. In other words, no matter what you do to this fellow, even if you try to apply pressure on him and put him through whatever rigorous argumentation you can, he's not going to respond because he's already beyond the point of no return. And so basically, Reb Sadia says, while I feel that I can refute these people, if you find them not accepting my arguments, it's because they're the category of the fools, or perhaps maybe we should call them the category of the nihilists, if we wanted to give them at least some level of deference or validation. So essentially, Reb Sadia now concludes this chapter. He's saying we have now completed these 12 incorrect theories. And because Reb Sadia says, I've now completed them, I figured let's just review them very quickly. We'll go from 2 to 13, because the reason he started with theory number 2 instead of theory number 1 is because theory number 1 is the correct theory, the correct narrative of the Torah, which basically states that God created the universe at a point in time from absolute nothingness, creatio ex nihilo. So let's go through and review these 12 models very briefly before we conclude. Number 2 was the spiritual atomic model. And that argument stated that God created our universe, but not ex nihilo, not from nothing, but rather from eternally existent spiritual materials that form the building blocks of our physical constructs. A bit Platonic sounding, but some kind of variation of Plato's primordial matter. Number 3, God created reality from a portion of himself. And those, again, who advance this model do so for the same reason as the previous one. They cannot deny the idea of a creator, but they cannot conceive of creatio ex nihilo because they've never witnessed creation of something from nothing. And therefore, so there were these elaborate models that other philosophers came up with to explain how something could come from nothing, because there really wasn't nothing. There was really something. What that something was, they struggle in order to produce what that something was. So the first model, number 2, had said that it's these atoms that are these substances which really defy description. The number 3 said that it was a portion of God himself. So God sort of scraped off a portion of himself and created physical reality from himself. Number 4 is a combination of the previous 2 models. Namely, this model asserts that God created spiritual beings from himself, like the angels and the celestial realm, and he created physical beings from these eternal primordial atoms. View number 5, which we spent a lot of time on, we spent one whole session just on the discussion of dualism, because Rabbi Sadia had spent probably the longest amount of time on that theory. Those who believe in 2 eternal creators. The whole basis of their belief is their denial that 2 opposites, good and evil, could emit from one singular source or being, because they had never witnessed anything like this. And the view of the dualists was not, they're not plagued by the same question as the previous theories of how can something come from nothing. Their issue was, how can good and evil coexist? And their conclusion is that there are 2 gods who co-created all that exists. And Reb Sadia refuted that as well. Model number 6, creation comes from the 4 natural states: heat, cold, dryness, and moisture. Every physical body is endowed with different degrees of combinations of these 4 states. These states existed independently before creation, and each was isolated and separated from the others. And at the moment of creation, these states combined, and through their combinations, gave rise to all physical bodies of our plane of existence. So that was another theory. But again, their motivation for putting forth this model is because there must have been something that God had created all of our physical reality from. And they say that it was these 4 states of being that God converted into elements and matter, and through combining them together, these abstract states, all of physical reality has emerged. And again, this was the theory of God using inanimate material for things to come into being, or that creation came into being by itself from these inanimate materials. Number 7, he called the creation from hule, which is formless matter. This formless matter, this is really straight out of Plato, gave rise to the 4 elements of earth, wind, fire, and water. These 4 elements in turn gave rise to all that exists in our terrestrial realm, in our world. Number 8, the heavens is the source of our terrestrial realm, because the heavens is made of something other than the 4 elements of our terrestrial existence, some kind of 5th element, and that is the cause of the existence of our world. So again, sort of suspending judgment as to whether there's a creator or not, but something came from something is really the argument. Number 9, creation by chance. There was no premeditation, no intelligent designer, either sentient or inanimate. Creation was that at some point in time, a group of elements of an unknown nature coalesced together, forming pressure against each other. The lighter products of this collision rose upwards to form heaven and the celestial bodies. The heavier products went downwards, and moisture formed upon them to create earth and the oceans on top of them. Number 10, eternal existence. This is straight out of Aristotle. Things as we experience them now have always been this way. We only accept that which our senses tell us. And since we have never seen a creation of these things from nothing, we must conclude that they have always existed as they are now. And Rabbi Sadia set out to prove that these Aristotelians are making inappropriate assumptions because they have never witnessed eternity either. So if you've never witnessed a certain phenomenon, either creation from nothing or eternality, why do you take the side of eternality, which is something unwitnessed, versus creatio ex nihilo, which is also unwitnessed? That was the basic gist of his argument. Number 11, epistemological relativism. That term really, which is not that difficult to appreciate, but the argument of the sophists, who basically, like we said before, believed that anything and everything is true because whatever the human mind is capable of conceiving is, in fact, reality. So if 2 people have differing views on the origins of the universe, one person believes the universe has always eternally existed, and the other one believes it was created in time, then in reality, both ideas are true. Reality of things depends solely on human thinking. Rabbi Sadia felt that that was pretty senseless, but not as senseless as the final 2, that of skepticism and that of the fools or the nihilists. So that just helps us review where we are up to at this point. And then Rabbi Sadia concludes by saying, I do not suggest that this is an exhaustive list of the theories for creation that exist in my time. In other words, Rabbi Sadia says, don't think that there are only 12 different ideas about cosmogony that are circulating in the 10th century. There are probably many, many more, but these are the primary theories, and there are others that are derivatives of these main categories. I therefore do not need to enumerate them all, because by refuting the ones in my list, the others are also refuted. And by refuting all the above, I have demonstrated that the only one remaining proposition that is true and correct is the Torah's narrative that all things were created in time, and that their creator created them ex nihilo, out of absolute nothingness, which is indeed, according to Reb Sadia, the Torah's depiction of reality, the Torah's depiction of the origins of the universe. And so it is with that that Reb Sadia closes out chapter 3. And remember, as we mentioned before, Rabbi Sadia is using a Kalamist methodology. It's not just enough to prove positively for what you believe in, but you also have to refute all those propositions that oppose your belief in order to be able to, so to speak, prove something or argue for it logically. So that's what we're going to do. Is we're going to have one more shiur to close out the first treatise. There's one more chapter. It's a very short chapter that will conclude this first treatise on creation. Once we're finished that, we will begin the second treatise of Reb Sadia about the unity of God, and that'll be our second project that we take on. But here we are. We'll do one more shiur right after Tisha B'Av, the day after Tisha B'Av, God willing, and then we'll take a break for a few weeks because of some of my travels. So I want to apologize. I think someone was trying to say something at the end of last week's class, but because my speakers weren't working, I couldn't hear them. But I have my speakers on now. Does anyone have any comments or questions before we break for today? Anyone?
Rabbi Karabkin.
Mm-hmm. Hi.
I was wondering, sorry, let me just put my video on. Sorry. I was just wondering what you think about the idea that number 13 is also a kind of argument about the impossibility of atheism.
Yeah, expand on that. What do you mean by that?
So first, it is remarkable that he calls them the fools, because that brings to mind what Solomon says as well, that the fool is he who in his heart says that there is no God.
Mm-hmm.
And he seems to spend a significant amount of time on this one. And it makes me think that part of that there's a kind of esoteric argument that he's making about the impossibility of actually living life as an atheist. Hence why he brings up the idea of your thirst must not be real, your hunger must not be real. I'm not articulating it well
Well,
right
I
now,
think,
but
yeah, no, I understand. I think the point that you're making is that he's basically saying that we all live with premises that are based on the most fundamental and basic assumptions about reality. And to sort of basically try to completely reject any kind of sensory perception or any kind of premises that our minds bring to us, no one can live that way. Now, that doesn't necessarily lead to uh, a suggestion that everyone, therefore, must really deep down believe in some kind of intelligent designer or some kind of God, because it is possible that people who accept reality for what it is, there's a whole school of science called naturalism, which believes that everything that is real is perceived by the senses. That is actually a modern model of scientific theory that I've quoted Sean Carroll a number of times already. And this school of naturalism therefore suggests that anything we need to know about the universe, we will discover by our senses. Anything that is still mysterious to us, it's not because our senses cannot perceive it, but rather just because we don't have the proper instrumentation yet to be able to detect that reality. We don't accept that either. In other words, I don't believe that Rebbe Sadia would go so far as to say that the mind, whatever the mind is capable of perceiving, is the definition of reality, because God far transcends human perception and understanding, and yet we accept the existence of God. So I think that there's some kind of middle ground. These people who Reb Sadia calls the fools, or what we would call the nihilists, completely reject anything that our perception brings to us. But that doesn't mean that Reb Sadia takes the opposite extreme, which the only things that are true are things that are brought to us by our senses. Does that make sense? Am I addressing your question?
yes, perfectly. Also, just a little an aside. There's Leo Strauss, I'm pretty sure, must be picking up one of the arguments here as well, because he has an essay that says that pure nihilism is impossible to live with, and it's quite close to this.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Okay, very good. Anyone else? Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Have a good week, and Bezrat Hashem, we hope to see you next time. Okay, take care.